Wonderful first slate of speakers. Thank you, all three of you, for your talks this morning. I am going to, I think, take the mic and move back to the computer to look at Q&A. Is that right, folks back there? Are there any questions in the room first? Oh, thank you, Nikolai. Are there questions in the room first for any of our speakers? All right, thank you. Okay. All right. Yes, please, Bella.
Hi, that was such a fantastic first set of 3 presentations that went together so beautifully. I learned so much from all 3 of you. I had a very practical question for Bernard, which is, how is this research going down with Bosch? How are they learning from what you're giving them? And are they not necessarily assuming that they are learning from it? What are they going to do with it? I found it really fascinating because I think you're offering something that is giving them a cultural critique that they might not be undertaking themselves.
I mean, I have to say the fellowship initially was already framed within a kind of understanding that an artist would come and engage with their researchers, and that this would be a kind of two-way dialogue that very much might, I mean, you know, within kind of the field of innovation management, you know, the artist, I don't know, plays a kind of court jester role perhaps in terms of inspiring the researchers there to think outside of the box and so forth. But I think that for me, the experience was genuinely a kind of experience of a reciprocity where conversations with individuals, once they were established, once a kind of level of trust was established, genuinely produced an emergent kind of a meeting of different kinds of frameworks, in a sense, and where some of the researchers certainly shared with me a sense of being able to look at the material, in a sense, these operational images, being allowed to look at them perhaps in other ways, including aesthetic ways, and finding time, in a sense, to step out of the very, you know, solution-driven timeline, in a sense, and the pressures for them to kind of constantly find or work towards their the outcomes they needed to produce, to actually look at the material for itself, some of the, you know, the visual material that they would produce, and that they step into a much longer history of images, in a sense, by working with these, that these images don't come from a vacuum. And I thought that was actually a really, yeah, wonderful experience for me as an artist, kind of working within that context.
Yes, Michael, we'll hand you the microphone.
It's a question for Bethany, actually. I haven't really quite thought it through, but just as you were speaking, you started using terms like positive charge and negative charge, and particularly the term latency and the parallels then with traditional analog photography. And I just wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit more about that, or whether there's a relevancy there with your own research.
Absolutely. So first off, I'm going to have the disclaimer that I'm not a physicist. And while this is starting to kind of go in that direction, or looking at the sensors requires some of that more scientific knowledge, I think there are quite a few parallels in terms of how even the original kind of sensors are discussed outside of applying it to images. So initially, this sensor was designed for memory, so it was applied to imaging. And so some of the terms that are used in terms of just invention and how this is coming into being have resonances with similar kind of conversations that you see around kind of invention of photography more generally. So looking at kind of some of the terms in memory, thinking about Talbot's work, if we look at that kind of legacy, the positive negative latency, I think Sean Cubitt looks at quite a bit in the book, Practices of Light, because there is, I think he pulled that through a longer history of images and imaging technology outside of photography as well. But I think there is more to be discussed in terms of the positive, negative charge, and also how kind of analog photography is also discussed in the same way in terms of on, off, 1, 0, or kind of there is a legacy there, which I think is part of the connection too. We assume that the digital is so kind of divorced from conversations around analog photography, and even the idea of positive, negative in terms of print. I think there is a lot of overlap there in a more kind of metaphorical way, as well as kind of the scientific or kind of literal explanation of what's happening.
Yes, we'll get you the microphone.
Hello, my name is Cynthia, and I have two questions for Bethany. One is, are you doing anything with Kasia Silverman's Miracle of Analogy, History of Photography, Part 1? Okay, I'm looking forward to hearing that, someday seeing that work. And then the other, are you doing anything with that sort of weird world of sensor surgery in which people are converting color sensors? Watching a few YouTube videos, I hope.
Yeah, so I think the project, as it's kind of, it's in its infancy. And so the beginning kind of was looking at the CCD as the first and kind of the invention of sensor. And I think I haven't looked into that specifically, so I can't say that, but I think it's a really, there are so many interesting examples of kind of applications of imaging sensors outside of this kind of traditional digital image. And so I think the hope is that some of the kind of conclusions of the project look at what the consequences are from kind of this one moment in history. So we think about the invention of this one sensor and kind of a particular application that is quite contested in kind of its invention history. There's a lot of drama around the 2009 Nobel Prize kind of that's awarded because of this. And so the legacy of that, I think, is kind of what's to come. So thank you so much for the example, because I think when we kind of look at sensors in visual culture, or we consider kind of the cultural impact of sensors, it goes well beyond photography, but it does start there. And so it's interesting that this is kind of one of the first applications that we see. And what does that kind of tell us about the drive to kind of produce digital imaging at that particular moment in time and in that space?
If anyone on Zoom has questions, please use the Q&A box and I'll moderate that. There's no open questions right now there. Bethany, I feel bad throwing another question your way, but I was so struck by that amazing Edwin Land quote, which I hadn't encountered before, and thought immediately at the point at which after I had my first child, I noticed there was more than 10,000 photos tagged of him on my phone, which happened, in the first year or so. And that sort of parallel. But obviously with Land, with Polaroid, it was such an expensive product. Did he think about how cost would factor into that goal? I mean, I don't think I can't imagine he saw that as something his company could do, since they never could get their costs down. Do you know?
Yeah, I'm not really sure, but I think it's interesting because that, again, it's the one step where like the mobile darkroom and kind of the novelty factor means that you kind of want to pay for that. And so I think this it's in 1970, and there's a really awesome video of him kind of walking and saying all of this. And it's kind of almost eerie because it, one, very closely mimics kind of Steve Jobs in the iPhone moment, or discussing what this will look like. And he is, in essence, describing the iPhone. And I think that has become kind of the number one application of this particular kind of sensor. And what I find very interesting is that that's what's driving some innovation, but not all. And so I don't know that there was maybe a discussion, possibly. I haven't done any archival work on Polaroid specifically, but what is interesting is that what he described also is a very expensive product. And so there is this interesting tie between this drive for certain applications in photography and in photo history, almost through despite cost, or, regardless, we're still going to go out and buy this because the one step is great. Or in the case of like an iPhone or a camera phone, the capacity to pull it out and take a photo, have it instantly stored or instantly share it, kind of the cost doesn't really dissuade.
Thank you. That's great. Any other questions in the room?
I have a question, if possible.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I have a question for both Yanai and Bethany. It's sort of playing the two of you against each other. And it's to think about the CCD sensor without a camera, and in a sense, to speculate or to extrapolate from the CCD sensor a kind of speculative constellation, if you like. And that is to think, if photography, if in analog photography, the photogram allows us to think of photography outside of the lens, outside of the diagrammatic of the camera and the lenticular. Is there an equivalent, either historically or in a sense speculatively, that allows us to think of the CCD sensor in terms of what the photogram does for analog photography?
Should I go first? Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I'm not sure it was a question, actually. It was a whole bunch of questions, which I would be delighted to answer, but no time today. I don't know that such an example exists, even though I could hypothetically speculate on a condition wherein a CCD sensor would be hallucinating. And of course, a CCD sensor need not be placed behind the lens. A CCD sensor is often, part of, numerous types of devices that aren't, associated with photography as we understand it commonly. And kind of thinking about that and comparing that to the photogram or kind of cameraless photograph is kind of a very interesting way to kind of frame the discussion. I would, however, like to pose a question for you or for everybody else. So if the kind of the cameraless CCD sensor is an example of a cameraless photograph, could we alternatively think of a photoless camera? Are we now dealing with photoless cameras or photoless types of photography? Because I think that is the kind of future that both your wonderful presentation as well as kind of Bethany's and perhaps my own have been implying or alluding to. And that is kind of completely irrespective of the term digital and analog, which I found to be kind of a bit confusing. Of course, I naturally treat the camera as a sensor among many. This is in fact something that Asko Lemuscalio, my collaborator, has actually written about. So the camera is but one type of sensor, and then if it is, then what kind of photoless cameras can we now think of?
I'd love to respond to that, but Bethany, I just wondered whether from your historical research also that you came across any instances in which the sensor sort of preceded the box containing it.
Well, I think, yeah, it's an interesting history because it's not designed for this purpose. And so I think that there is kind of the box is put on it for this kind of particular outcome. And so the CCD is initially designed around kind of looking at different ways to, I think, work on memory generally is what was kind of happening. And I think at the time there was a threat of like a loss of funding. So they really did sit down in a room in an afternoon and were like, we got to get something going here. Otherwise, there's no kind of outcome. And so that's kind of part of where the cultural history, I think, is an interesting resource for thinking through kind of unintended implications, because that wasn't the design here. And so I'm not sure. I think there's ways to work with these sensors that produce outcomes that aren't representational images. And so that might not be speculative, but just because the image is not kind of a realist image, or just because it's not something that we can recognize, does that make it an image? Does that make it a photograph? What's going on there? And I think the work of the artist, Stephen Cornford, who I think is a UK-based artist, he's done a couple works with CCD sensors, specifically saturation trails is one. And I would encourage everyone to check it out because it's fantastic, but it also plays with kind of the materiality of the CCD sensor, but also the kinds of representational possibilities outside of kind of putting it into a camera, attaching it to a memory card, then putting it into another device, printing them out, seeing them throughout that process, because of this multi-step process required to actually see the image as we might recognize it. So, but yeah, I'd love to hear your response.
No, I mean, I think that's spot on, kind of what I was going to touch on as well. I think the photoless camera is the apparatus that operates in real time operationally, that does not produce an image or anything recognizably an image, but simply processes data and is part of a pipeline, in a sense, a functional pipeline, right? So but I think that from my research, what becomes interesting is that as much no matter how far away you get from images in these operational sort of workflows or pipelines, these pipelines are kind of haunted, if you like. I hate to use that, the sort of overused spectral kind of metaphor, but there is the latency, in a sense, that you also kind of mentioned. There is a cultural latency, in a sense. There are images that travel with these operational workflows. But I think that is the work of media archaeology, in a sense, also to retrieve those. And there is no such thing as a purely functional image operation, I think, because it cannot kind of cut itself off in a vacuum. I think that would be my take on that. That actually, and I think one of the reasons why I think there's a lot of interest in operational images is because of the, there's almost a kind of frisson of coming from the arts and humanities to kind of encounter something that might be completely bereft of a kind of cultural memory. And then that becomes a task, right? To then retrieve that, or to kind of, in fact, actually and perhaps to kind of reconstruct that.
Could I respond to that? Yeah, that is a very, very precise point. So the first, the point about Tim Cornford's work, I mean, if we want to look at an earlier example that actually predates Cornford, then we could think about the Hiroshi Sugimoto work. I'm blanking on the title, but I would want to say something like Electricity Made Visible, but that's not the title. It's a work wherein he actually records electric currents and then outputs them as photographs. And so that would be a fine example of a sensor hallucination. Now, as per operational pipelines or networks or chains, I would much prefer this term to the kind of operational image, which has become a very, very fashionable term. I find it to be somewhat of a contradiction in terms, obviously, because image viewers may be operational, but the images themselves are not operational. What is actually operational is the infrastructure beneath them. I would say beneath and not above, as in Bernd's example of the fabric covering occluding the painting. So the infrastructure is actually the subface of the image. The surface of the image is what we humans can see. And now, do operational networks or pipelines exist which have absolutely no kind of association with images or imagery? So that is certainly a depressing thought from the point of view of a human. And of course, we humans are kind of so indebted to ocular centrism, at least kind of in Occidental thought. And so we kind of tend to reject the possibility that there's, something happening that we will never have access to. And I find that thought to be peculiar. I mean, why would we assume that there could only be known unknowns and there couldn't be any unknown unknowns? And even the kind of tendency to refer to operational images as opposed to operational audio. I mean, there could be operational audio. There's no reason why there shouldn't be, and yet we tend to think that everything operational, every subface system actually has to have some kind of visual latency in it. That is a kind of deeply human desire, I think. But yeah, I mean, we could go on, and maybe other people have some other questions.
Actually, we're just about at time. So if there's any last comments, feel free to jump in. But otherwise, it'll be about a 15-minute break.